Now let's look at how these percent B and bandwidth indicators help the trend trade. So understand the bandwidth adds clarity to not just the squeeze, but also to the trend trade, even without the squeeze. How does that happen? Well, oftentimes what will happen is the bands kind of get established in a range and then they start to expand. Even though there may not have ever been a squeeze, that's usually going to be the precursor to the trend trade. The bulge tells you where the trend is likely to be ending here. This is a really valuable signal that you get. And then, of course, the percent B is very valuable in the trend trade in terms of showing you the divergence and the overbought and oversold. But really, the divergence is the one that really tells you the end of the trend trade. So here's the signals we get. Let me kind of put it on a bumper sticker. We get some insight that the bands are starting to expand as part of the trend trade. We really get insights when the trend trade is ending, which is obviously a very, very valuable signal to see. Take a look over here at DuPont and notice the bands are starting to contract, but we're far from a squeeze. I mean, look at the bandwidth relativity. We had a squeeze earlier. It was very, very low bandwidth. We're not even halfway back to that point yet, but we are getting ready to establish a trend trade. And if you look at the trade itself, notice this trade's getting established inside the bands for a trend trade. We had a dip down here, back up basically inside the bands as part of the trend trade, back up inside of the bands as part of the trend trade. And so this happens, but what will confuse people is they think, well, there's no trend coming because I didn't see a big squeeze. Well, look at what's happening. Look at how the bandwidth actually helped us here. As you're falling, I'm circling the detail inside the circle here. As you're falling, we see that the bandwidth starts to tick back up, and that's showing us that, oh, this thing is starting to expand a little bit. We actually did have a bit more of a squeeze here. There's your head fake right back into the trend trade. And then on the right side of the screen over here, again, you're pushing up into the upper band. Not really a squeeze, far from a squeeze that took place here. But you see how the bandwidth continues to tick higher and higher, supporting that trade. And of course, we see the ends of these moves when we see the decrease in the bandwidth. Let me point out a couple of those on this screen for you. Obviously, the big bulge after the squeeze, that was the decrease there. But if you come over here to the middle, look in January. This was kind of a move that was starting to get a little bit stagnant in here. And you notice how the bands started to contract, and it was really showing the end of that previous move. The other thing that you're going to notice in here is you're going to notice some divergences taking place with your percent B indicator in here. Notice we've got some divergence taking place between these two peaks. Not a huge one, but we have some happening in here. We really have a lot of momentum starting to shift here with this move. I'm going to put it in a square. With this move that's happening in January, and you see how the percent B is just coming back in basically to the zero line inside of that move itself there. So this is some of the pictures you'll get. Let's take a look over here at another trade. This is on 3M. This is a very good picture of a couple of things. Number one, we did not have a squeeze, but it played out like a squeeze very similarly. You see the bandwidth clicking up here. And then look at the divergence that happened. This is oftentimes the way a percent B divergence will look. It's not always the nice peaks that we're used to seeing with some oscillators. A lot of times it just shows that slow, steady decline pulling away from the band. Remember, the percent B is showing where we are relative to the band. Look at this stock price. It's pulling away from the band. That is a reversal. That is not a strong signal. The more it pulls away from the band, the further it's getting away and less strength that it's revealing. So that's what you see happening with percent B. So percent B is ticking downward consistently, not showing the trade is done, but showing it's losing some of its momentum. And then, of course, we ended up moving back into a bit of a squeeze play here where we finally broke out into that. And then again, your percent B down here showing you some of the cycle and the oscillation that's happening inside that move there. Let's take one more look here. This is a really nice clean trend trade on the US dollar against the Canadian dollar. Notice this almost looks like a squeeze. It's not quite a squeeze, but it almost looks like a squeeze. If we went back, you'd see there's a little bit better squeezing activity later, or earlier, I should say. But notice how this oscillation works. This is a really good picture of a couple of the oscillation ideas in here. Bandwidth obviously increases in here. We run up into the upper band. We're overbought. We cycle back down to the middle band. We make that turn back up, and you see how this is just literally oscillating inside this trend trade here. Now watch as we get outside the band. We're very overbought. We're right at the band, and there's your divergence starting to take place. Now this is going to be signaling the end of a trend trade. And that's one of the great signals that you get here with this combination of indicators, especially the percent B. I really, I could live without any of these, but I like the bandwidth at the beginning of the trade with the squeezes. I love the percent B at the end of the swing by seeing that divergence, especially when you can pair it up with a picture like this Bollinger Band picture mixed with this percent B. You see that divergence there. It's just a really, really great oscillator showing you specifically with those touches to the band where that divergence is coming into play. You don't really get this divergence picture with any of the other oscillators. Now, while I'm talking about that, let me go a step further and say the percent B divergences is not necessarily going to show the end of a trend the same way that say for example, MACD divergence would show. MACD will show the end of an intermediate trend completely. Percent B will be more the minor level trend, and it may really be indicating more of a sideways move coming than a full reversal, but it's still exceptionally valuable, especially as an options trader where you're trying to capture that surge of trade and then get out for the sideways moves. Percent B is really an invaluable signal that you can use for that, and I really like using it a lot. I don't typically teach it a lot because it starts to add up a whole lot of different indicators people are looking at, but secretly I look at this one behind closed doors quite often to get a perspective of where things are relative to the Bollinger Bands.